courteous. Thank you for being courteous.
Of course. If we could call the hearing to order, we'll proceed in the usual fashion with opening statements by myself and Ranking Member Grassley, followed by my introduction of the three witnesses, and then each of you have 5 minutes to make your opening statement. Your full testimony will be made a part of the record. I urge you to confine your remarks to those 5 minutes so we have a chance to engage with you. And I also want to welcome Chair Murray and Senator Braun to the committee hearing. This is about the tax injustices that are presently baked into our tax code. As everybody knows, there are two sides to the budget: spending and revenues. And while some of our colleagues only want to look at the spending side, the U.S. has never run a balanced budget in the modern era without revenues nearing 20% of GDP. And of course, most revenues come through the tax system. Today's hearing will tell of two distinct sets of tax rules that produce a rigged, corrupted, and deficient tax system. Under one set of rules, for most Americans, paying taxes is immediate and automatic. Taxes are withheld from every paycheck to fund the public goods that contribute to our happiness and security: roads, schools, parks, veterans care, the military. Under this set of rules, taxes also are paid on all income for Social Security and Medicare, programs that let Americans retire with dignity and afford medical care. Under these rules, a typical teacher or iron worker in Rhode Island might pay a federal tax rate over 20%, as would a married couple running a small business earning salaries of $150,000 a year. But it's different rules for the wealthy and well-connected. Billionaires and large multinational corporations get special rules that let them pick when and even if they pay taxes. This corrupted tax code lets billionaires pay an average tax rate of just 8.2%, less than half the rate of a typical teacher or firefighter. Thanks to the Trump tax law, large multinational corporations average even less, just 7.8%. Some pay zero. Simple fairness is reason enough to end this rigged system. But the tax dodging also blows a hole in our federal budget. The Center for American Progress reports that tax cuts for the wealthy have been a primary driver of deficits for decades, accounting for more than half of the debt increase as a share of the economy. Letting wealthy business owners avoid Medicare taxes on their full income costs Medicare $250 billion in lost revenue. Letting billionaires pay low or zero tax rates costs America $550 billion. Letting multinational corporations shift profits to tax havens leaves a $1 trillion bill for everyone else to pay. Common sense reforms can make our tax code fairer while reducing the deficit. First, to protect the long-term solvency of Social Security and Medicare, I'm filing legislation to require contributions to Social Security taxes on high-end income. Right now, the cap on contributions means someone making $1 million effectively stopped paying into Social Security February 28th of this year. People living on investment income pay no Social Security contribution. Respecting the Biden tax pledge, my Medicare and Social Security Fair Share Act will require Social Security contributions on all income above $400,000, however earned. This legislation includes the Biden budget tax plan we saw to extend the solvency of Medicare by 20 years. Second, billionaire Warren Buffett famously highlighted the rigged tax code by pointing out that he paid a lower tax rate than his secretary. So I'm also reintroducing the Paying a Fair Share Act to codify the so-called Buffett rule with a minimum 30% tax rate beginning on income over $1 million per year, whatever the source. Third, American multinationals recently reported $60 billion in profits in the Cayman Islands in a single year. 10 times the size of that entire economy. That is a scam. It costs American jobs, and it's very unfair to American businesses, large and small, that don't engage in overseas tax games. My No Tax Breaks for Outsourcing Act would make offshoring companies pay the same tax rate domestic companies pay here at home. House MAGA Republicans have yet to release a budget for the American people to see, but they've sure made clear who they want to protect. Their first vote was to protect wealthy tax cheats by hobbling IRS enforcement, adding $114 billion to the debt. Then they filed legislation to make the Trump tax cuts permanent, a $3 trillion cost with over 40% of the benefit to the top 5% in income. Some have even proposed a new 30% sales tax on everything. The Conservative American Enterprise Institute says this all could add $18 trillion of debt. Behind all this secrecy and mischief lurks a crew of Republican dark money donors who don't want to pay taxes and are so rich they don't care about Medicare, Social Security, or the economic well-being of wage earners. Selling their poison to the public is hard. But if you put Americans' priorities first, it gets pretty easy. And the math works. So I look forward to hearing the testimony today about fixing a tax system rigged for wealthy political donors. And I turn now to our distinguished ranking member, Senator Grassley.
Republicans know that Social Security and Medicare are part of the social fabric of America, and we're committed to maintaining it as that part of social fabric. And we also know that it needs to be dealt with sooner than later, because the sooner it's dealt with, the easier it's going to be handled than if we wait too long, as Reagan and Tip O'Neill did in 1983 when it was about busted. But they made a bipartisan decision that probably at the time they thought it was maybe only good for a couple decades, but it's turning out to be an agreement that has kept Social Security as a sound program through at least 2033. So let's hope that we don't wait as long as they did to find a solution to it. And when we do find a solution to it, that is good for the next 60 years. So, Mr. Chairman, I thank you for holding this hearing today. Revenues to the federal government are a fundamental part of the budget and a subject that this committee ought to be studying. However, I want to stress that the fundamental problem that we have in the federal budget is not one of undertaxation, but overspending, and I hope through this day that I'll be able to show that as a necessary part of what we're doing. The last time the federal budget was balanced was in 2001. Revenues at that time were 18.9% of gross domestic product. Last year, federal revenues amounted to 19.6% GDP. Yet, we still managed to run a deficit of 1 4/10 trillion. That's because even though tax collections have increased by 2 9/10 trillion since 2001, spending has grown by 4.4 trillion. Another issue that we should address is the difference between tax avoidance and tax evasion. Tax avoidance is the legal minimization of tax liability. Tax evasion is the failure to pay taxes that everybody knows you owe, including the taxpayer. Tax evasion is a crime. Tax avoidance is legal and frequently encouraged by Congress. The tax code is full of various credits, deductions, and other incentives that are usually tied to a behavior Congress decided to incentivize. In fact, taxpayers have a right to pay only what tax is legally due. It's also important to remember that a tax loophole is an ambiguity in the law exploited in a way not intended or foreseen. It's not simply a policy with which one disagrees. When it comes to closing actual loopholes and cracking down on tax cheats, my record as a former chairman and/or ranking member of Finance Committee is second to none. One only needs to look at my investigation uncovering tax cheats in the Conservation Easement Program and my creation of the IRS Whistleblower Office has reclaimed billions from tax fraud, to name just two examples. And that bill passed in 2005, I think, would add up to about $6 billion coming in as a result of that legislation. I also want to stress that the U.S. has a progressive tax system. Nothing I think members on the other side of the aisle is willing to look at. But we have an analysis published by the Biden Treasury Department that quote unquote has these words in between the quotes. Total federal taxes are progressive. Families at the bottom of the income spectrum often have a negative federal tax liability due to refundable credits. In contrast, those in the top 1% pay close to 1/3 of their income in federal taxes. Nonpartisan experts at the Congressional Budget Office and the Joint Committee on Taxation have come to similar conclusions. So have outside groups like the Tax Foundation and the Tax Policy Center. IRS data also bears out the progressive nature of our tax system. Based on tax year 2020 returns, the top 1% of the taxpayers by adjusted gross income paid more than 42% of the total federal income tax. Now, some people would say 42% isn't enough. I'd like to have somebody that says it's not enough. When is enough enough? I have a hard time getting an answer to that question. If it's 43%, maybe we'll join you in doing it if we can have a stop to the demagoguery that goes on arguing about that. Congress should regularly examine tax incentives, just as we should review spending programs to ensure that we're working, that they are working as we intend. If my Democrat colleagues are on the hunt for tax subsidies that benefit large corporations and the wealthy, they need look no further than the legislation that was enacted on a purely partisan basis just last August. Their ill-named Inflation Reduction Act included hundreds of billions of dollars in new or expanded tax incentives. Included in this legislation are novel new tax features such as quote-unquote direct pay and quote-unquote transferability. We had to deal with that in the 1980s and it tended to be a really bad policy that 2 years later we changed. That actually made it, now this direct pay and transferability actually made it easier for corporations and wealthy investors to pay little or no tax. These provisions will not only further complicate the tax code and primarily benefit the affluent, but recent estimates suggest their costs could be far greater than Congress was originally led to believe. We helped create the tax avoidance problem, and last year's Democrat made it even worse. As one former Finance Committee chairman used to say, quote, many taxpayers accept complexity that favors them, end of quote. If we really want to diminish the advantage that wealthy taxpayers and large corporations have, we should address the complexity of the tax code. This is a bipartisan problem, but fortunately solving it is within our control. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Grassley. and agreed on the complexity problem. I want to welcome the witnesses. Dr. Kim Klausing is the Eric M. Zolt Chair in Tax Law and Policy at the University of California, Los Angeles. Klausing is an economist who previously served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Tax Analysis at Treasury. She is an expert on international corporate profit shifting. Kind of unfortunate there has to be expertise in that particular behavior, but there we are. Our second witness is Dr. Danny Yegan, who is an associate professor of economics at the University of California, Berkeley, and research associate with the National Bureau of Economic Research. Yegan previously served as the chief economist at the Office of Management and Budget. His research focuses on the individual income tax and taxation of capital gains. Dr. William McBride is the Vice President of Federal Tax Policy and Stephen J. Enton Fellow in Economics at the Tax Foundation, where he leads efforts to research, model, and reform the U.S. tax code. While at PricewaterhouseCoopers, Dr. McBride conducted economic impact and general quantitative analyses and researched the economics of taxation and issues related to tax reform at the state, federal, and international levels. In a prior stint at the Tax Foundation, he wrote extensively on the economics of taxation, particularly regarding business investment. Dr. McBride holds a Bachelor of Science in Electrical Engineering and a Bachelor of Science in Physics and a PhD in Economics. I welcome you all, and why don't we begin with Dr. Klausing and proceed across the table.
Chairman Whitehouse, Ranking Member Grassley, members of the committee, thank you so much for inviting me today to share my views on corporate tax avoidance. In my testimony today, I will discuss 4 key flaws in U.S. law, and I will suggest simple reforms that can improve the tax system across those dimensions. First, current law contains large tax preferences for offshoring and profit shifting. Imagine the incentives of a U.S. multinational company. If it earns income in Iowa or Rhode Island, it pays tax from the first dollar at 21%. On the other hand, if it earns income in a zero tax rate jurisdiction abroad, the first 10% return on tangible assets is completely free of U.S. tax, and the return above that is taxed at a 50% discount relative to U.S. income. This provides a large incentive to earn income offshore rather than in the United States. Somewhat astonishingly, there's even an incentive to earn income in France or Japan relative to the United States, and those are both countries with a higher corporate tax rate. The reason is if you earn income in France or Japan, you accumulate tax credits, which you can use to offset the income that would have been due on the zero tax rate jurisdiction income. This means that a savvy taxpayer can blend income from high tax and low tax jurisdictions and get to a rate that's approximately half the U.S. rate. I often call this an America Last tax system, since all foreign income is preferred to U.S. income. And in my written testimony, I show that this system has large effects on the behavior of U.S. multinational companies. A second flaw in the current system is that we forego large amounts of tax revenue by failing to reform it. If you look at scores from JCT or Treasury, you'll see that there are hundreds of billions of dollars available and left on the table from not fixing these offshoring and profit-shifting incentives. A third flaw in the current system is that it favors large multinational companies relative to small businesses. And these large companies often wield significant market power. These tax preferences reduce the ability of small businesses to compete in a fair and level playing field with big businesses. U.S. multinationals often pay single-digit tax rates, far lower than those faced by smaller businesses. And a tax system that favors the big companies relative to the small companies will tax economic rents or profits above the normal rate at a much lower rate than the normal profits. And economists on both the right and the left of the political spectrum agree that it's more efficient to tax these above normal profits than to tax normal returns to capital. A final flaw in the current system is that corporate tax avoidance reduces the fairness of our tax system. It benefits corporate shareholders at the expense of middle-class taxpayers. In recent decades, corporate profits have been much higher as a share of the economy at the same time that the labor share of income has shrunk and economic inequality has increased substantially. Our tax system too often turbocharges these trends by lowering the tax burden on capital income and on rents and disproportionately targeting tax cuts towards the top of the distribution. Fortunately, there are reforms at the ready that can address these flaws in the current law. And Senator Whitehouse's proposal and his sponsored legislation shows one promising path forward. For example, the No Tax Breaks for Outsourcing Act would end the offshoring incentives that are baked into current law, raising revenue in a fair and efficient manner. These reforms are consistent with the spirit of the international tax reforms that have been suggested by the Biden administration. And we should note that international tax reform just got a lot easier than it used to be because many other countries are in the process of implementing strong country-by-country minimum taxes. This means that U.S. reforms will not disadvantage U.S. companies, and they will better align with what the rest of the world is doing. Today, the U.S. is facing a challenging fiscal situation. As I detail in my testimony, large deficits and debt require fiscal responsibility, and this means looking for new sources of tax revenue. Spending cuts alone will not be sufficient. In this regard, I would also commend Senator Whitehouse for his great leadership on climate, alongside several of his peers on this committee. Congress took important action on the climate through the Inflation Reduction Act. These policies are an important step forward for climate change mitigation. In the future, these steps will be even more effective if they are accompanied by legislative measures that levy a fee on carbon emissions and that end the fossil fuel subsidies that are already in our current tax code. A carbon fee can easily be designed to avoid adverse consequences on consumers, and it would be an enormously effective tool to combat carbon emissions while raising much-needed revenue at the same time. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Professor. Dr. Yegan.
Chairman Whitehouse, Ranking Member Grassley, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify before you. Today on Tax Day, I describe two simple ways that the wealthy legally avoid taxes and how curbing them would raise $750 billion to pay for congressional priorities and protect our fiscal path. First, the wealthy often label their income in ways that trigger less tax. The quote, Gingrich-Edwards loophole, so named after two prominent users, is a focus of Chairman Whitehouse's new bill today and also my academic research. The Gingrich-Edwards loophole enables high-end workers to classify their labor income as what is called, quote, pass-through income and thereby escape Medicare taxes. Co-authors and I have shown that U.S. top earners are dominated by lawyers, consultants, and also managers of everyday medium-sized businesses like car dealership chains and beverage distributors. If you're a lawyer, consultant, or a business manager and get paid in W-2 wages like the rest of us, you owe Medicare taxes on that income. But if you do that same work and also own part of the business you work at, you can get paid in Schedule E pass-through income and thereby escape Medicare taxes. Same labor income, but labeled in a way that triggers less tax. The result is what the Treasury Inspector General has called a, quote, multi-billion-dollar employment tax shelter, end quote, that is unavailable to everyday Americans. Closing the Gingrich-Edwards loophole for high-end workers would raise $306 billion over the next 10 years. Second, in research now forthcoming in the Oxford Review of Economic Policy, Greg Leiserson and I estimated that the Forbes 400 wealthiest Americans from 2010 to 2018 paid an average federal individual income tax rate of 8% on their full income, including capital gains on unsold stock. How is that possible? Top business owners make most of their income in the form of rising stock values. They do not pay individual income tax on that income until they sell. And if they never sell, and instead bequeath the stock to their heirs, no one ever pays income tax on those billions of, quote, unrealized capital gains. Think of two people who created enormous personal wealth during their lifetimes, entertainer Frank Sinatra and Walmart owner Sam Walton. At current federal tax rates, Frank Sinatra would pay about 40% in federal income tax on his wage income, much more than Sam Walton would pay on his stock income under low effective individual tax rates, even after factoring in corporate income taxes. Congress has three options for raising effective tax rates on top business owners and closing the gap between a Sinatra tax burden and a Walton tax burden. It can raise effective corporate income tax rates, raise dividend and capital gains rates, or broaden the capital gains tax base by taxing unrealized gains, as in Senator Wyden's billionaire's income tax proposal. Here, I will discuss that proposal's child, President Biden's billionaire minimum income tax, which has 55 co-sponsors in the House, would cover the 20,000 households with wealth over $100 million, and in its latest version, would raise $436 billion over 10 years. My written testimony contains a plain English FAQ, but here's how the minimum tax would work. If a covered household is already paying 25% of their income, including unrealized gains, like, say, a star entertainer earning wages, they would pay no extra tax. But if tax-free unrealized gains allows them to pay less than 25%, they would owe a top-up payment to meet the 25% minimum. Those top-up payments could be paid over 5 to 9 years and would be a prepayment of capital gains tax owed upon sale, gift, or bequest. Charity would be exempt. Illiquid taxpayers could opt out of prepayments on their private stock gains and instead pay later with interest. Slow and partial prepayment on public stock gains, combined with prepayments from liquid taxpayers on their private stock gains, would preserve incentives to take companies public. The minimum tax is flexible and makes space for compromise. For example, Congress could dial the minimum tax rate down to 15%. Entrepreneurs taking a company public could be granted 20 years to pay. Thank you. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Professor. And Dr. McBride.
Thank you, Chairman Whitehouse, Ranking Member Grassley, and members of the committee. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you. My testimony will focus on the size and distribution of the federal tax burden. Last year, the federal government collected an all-time high of $4.9 trillion in taxes. At 19.6% of GDP, this is the highest level in 22 years. And prior to that, World War II. The largest source of revenue for the federal government is individual income taxes, which surged 29% last year to reach $2.6 trillion, or 10.5% of GDP, the highest level on record. This is partly explained by surging capital gains revenue and partly by the longer-term rise of pass-through business income. Now about half of business income is taxed under the individual income tax code, as owners of partnerships, S corporations, and other pass-through businesses report profits on their individual income tax returns. The remainder of business income is subject to the corporate income tax. Nonetheless, corporate income tax collections last year also came in at an all-time high of $425 billion. As a share of GDP, corporate income tax collections reached 1.7%, about equal to the average level for the last 30 years. Combined, corporate and individual income taxes reached 12.2% of GDP last year. That's the highest level in over 50 years. Most of the federal income tax burden is paid by high earners, as is the majority of the entire federal tax burden. According to the latest IRS data, of all federal individual income taxes collected, the top 5% of individual taxpayers paid a 62.7% share, while the top 1% of individual taxpayers paid a 42.3% share, a larger share than the bottom 95% of individual taxpayers combined.